Trade routes connected these communities. Though the Amazon is vast, rivers served as highways. Dugout canoes, long and narrow, could carry people and goods across hundreds of kilometers. Pottery styles show variation but also shared elements, suggesting interaction between regions. It is not hard to imagine traders paddling downriver, carrying fish, ceramics, or exotic feathers to distant neighbors. Some goods may have traveled even farther, hinting at networks that reached beyond the forest. When Europeans arrived in the 16th century, they stepped into a landscape still humming with these rhythms. Orellana's reports of large populations may not have been exaggerations after all. Archaeological estimates now suggest that millions of people may have lived in the Amazon basin before contact. Entire societies were structured around earth, water, and forest. But within a century of European arrival, silence replaced their voices. The cause of this silence was not the jungle itself, but disease. Like so many civilizations of the Americas, Amazonian societies had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and influenza. Even before Europeans penetrated deeply into the forest, diseases spread along rivers and trade routes. Communities weakened, populations collapsed, and with their decline came the unraveling of networks and traditions. Villages once filled with life fell quiet. Forests reclaimed plazas, mounds, and roads. Over generations, the jungle erased the memory of those who had shaped it. This is why the Amazon appeared empty when later colonists and explorers arrived. They saw scattered groups of survivors and assumed that had always been the case. The grandeur of the past had already been covered in vines. To them, the idea of a civilization here seemed impossible. And so the narrative of wilderness, triumphant archaeologists began peeling it back centuries later. Even now, the process is slow, painstaking, and often dull. Excavations mean hours of careful troweling in damp soil, recording every fragment of pottery, every shard of bone. LiDAR surveys reveal patterns, but interpretation requires patience. The evidence is not spectacular in the way of pyramids or palaces. Instead, it is fragments of everyday life: fire pits, post holes, discarded tools that quietly reshape our understanding. And yet, this slowness is what makes the story powerful. You realize that history is not only made of battles and rulers, but also of countless ordinary people whose lives built systems of resilience. They worked the soil, they built mounds, they tended fires, they raised children. Their names are gone, but their survival strategies remain beneath the trees. Now, as you settle deeper into this thought, you wonder, if millions once lived in harmony with the forest, what does that say about how we view the Amazon today? Do we still imagine it as untouched wilderness? Or can we begin to see it as a cultural landscape, a place as shaped by human hands as any ancient city of stone? The forest seems to whisper, but the answer is unclear. And so, this section closes with the question: if an entire civilization could disappear into green silence, what does it mean for the way we measure greatness and permanence in history? You find yourself returning to the forest once more, but this time you are not searching for fragments of soil or shards of pottery. You are searching for the meaning of it all: the rise, the silence, and the rediscovery of a civilization that disappeared beneath the canopy. The story of the Amazon's lost societies is not one of dramatic collapse, of burning cities or invading armies, but rather one of slow unraveling. Diseases carried by strangers spread like shadows along the rivers. Communities once tied together through trade and shared rituals began to fragment. As populations dwindled, knowledge systems weakened. A mound left untended began to erode. A canal clogged with silt became useless. Little by little, the human fingerprints on the forest blurred, and nature reclaimed the stage. For the descendants of these people, the indigenous groups who survived the forest was both home and graveyard. They inherited fragments of tradition, memories of ancestors who once lived in villages far larger than their own. Oral histories carried echoes of places that had been abandoned. To outsiders, these groups seemed like remnants of primitive life. But in truth, they were survivors of catastrophe, carrying the weight of lost worlds on their shoulders. As centuries passed, the forest grew thicker. Vines swallowed ditches. Trees spread their roots across plazas. Birds nested where families once gathered. To anyone arriving from Europe in the 18th or 19th century, there was no sign of cities or great fields. The assumption of emptiness became doctrine, a belief that the Amazon had always been wilderness. And yet, the forest kept its memory in quiet ways. The black earth of Terra Preta remained fertile. The geometry of earthworks lingered beneath layers of green pottery shards surfaced when farmers tilled their fields. For those who cared to look closely, whispers of another story persisted. The rediscovery of this civilization did not come with a single revelation, but unfolded gradually, through patient work. In the 20th century, archaeologists began to take indigenous oral traditions and early explorer accounts more seriously. Orellana's reports, once dismissed as fantasy, were reconsidered. Could it be that the vast settlements he described were real? Evidence grew. Farmers spoke of soils richer than anything around them. Roads appeared on aerial photographs, too straight to be natural. The advent of LiDAR in the early 21st century transformed the search entirely. From the air, lasers pierced through the canopy to reveal what the naked eye could not. Networks of geometric enclosures, vast fields of mounds, and interconnected sites across thousands of square kilometers. What was once invisible became undeniable. These findings did more than rewrite the Amazon's past. They challenged how we think about civilization itself. For centuries, history textbooks defined civilization through stone architecture, written records, and monumental art. By those standards, the Amazon seemed empty. But here, people had reshaped their world with perishable materials: wood, soil, fire, and plants. Their monuments were orchards and canals, not temples of stone. Their archives were oral, not written. You realize that this is why they were forgotten. The criteria of history itself was biased. What could not be carved in marble was ignored. What could not be preserved in ink was dismissed. The Amazonian civilizations remind you that human achievement can take many forms, some lasting only as long as memory or soil. Daily life here was as complex as anywhere. Ceramics reveal artistic traditions, with painted motifs and intricate shapes. Figurines suggest beliefs tied to fertility, nature, and ancestors. Circular village layouts point to social organization, with plazas serving as communal centers. These were not isolated tribes scratching a living from poor soil. They were organized, innovative, and deeply attuned to their environment. The question remains, what can we learn from them today? Perhaps one lesson is humility. Modern society often prides itself on technology and permanence, yet here was a culture that built resilience in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They engineered soil that remains fertile 500 years later. They cultivated forests that continue to bear food centuries after abandonment. Their systems outlasted their names. Another lesson lies in fragility. A civilization of millions collapsed in a matter of generations. When confronted with diseases they could not resist. No matter how ingenious their agriculture or social systems, they were not immune to forces beyond their control. In that sense, their story echoes the broader history of the Americas, a reminder of how contact, often invisible and unintended, reshaped entire worlds. Today, indigenous communities across the Amazon still carry fragments of this legacy. Their knowledge of plants, soils, and rivers reflects continuities with ancestors who once built earthworks and tended gardens. Modern archaeology increasingly collaborates with these communities, recognizing that the key to understanding the past lies not only in satellites or excavations, but also in memory and tradition passed down in stories. You close your eyes and picture a plaza in the heart of the forest. Children play while elders gather at the center, sharing food and stories. Around them, homes stand on stilts, and beyond the plaza, gardens and orchards stretch into the trees. It is not a city of stone, but it is a city nonetheless, ordered and meaningful. Though centuries have passed, its traces remain beneath the forest that hides it. As you drift deeper into this thought, the line between presence and absence blurs. The civilization has vanished, yet it endures in soils, in patterns, in memories. The Amazon you think of as wilderness is in truth a cultural landscape, shaped by countless hands. And so this story ends, not with certainty, but with reflection. If a civilization can vanish so completely beneath the forest, what does that say about our own? Will the traces we leave behind be any more lasting, or will they too be swallowed by time, leaving only faint whispers for those who come after? Story 2. The Forgotten City of Maraggio Island. You imagine the river widening as it nears the sea, carrying with it the weight of thousands of tributaries. Here, at the mouth of the Amazon, lies Maraggio Island, an expanse so large it could be mistaken for a small country. Today, it appears quiet, its grasslands dotted with cattle and its wetlands crisscrossed by creeks. To you, it may seem like just another corner of the world. And yet, beneath this landscape lies the memory of a people who thrived for centuries, whose achievements were hidden in plain sight, and whose city-like settlements remained forgotten until modern times. Maraggio is not a small place. Covering more than 40,000 square kilometers, it is the world's largest river island. From above, it is a mosaic of flooded plains, forest patches, and winding waterways. To survive here requires constant adaptation. The annual floods transform dry land into marshes, and the cycle of wet and dry dictates the rhythms of life. For outsiders, such an environment might seem unwelcoming, a place for scattered communities at most. Yet beginning more than 1,000 years ago, people on Maraggio turned this watery expanse into a stage for one of the most remarkable pre-Columbian cultures of South America. Archaeologists now call it the Maraggio culture. For centuries, its memory was buried, its traces overlooked or dismissed as too grand to belong to indigenous builders. Early scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries, influenced by prejudices of their time, even argued that the island's mounds and artifacts must have been the work of a lost foreign people, perhaps influenced by distant civilizations. They could not believe that indigenous Amazonians could have created such complexity on their own. Only later, through careful excavation and analysis, did the truth emerge. The Maraggio people were the architects of their own achievements. The most visible legacy they left behind are the mound's artificial earthworks rising above the floodplains. Some were small, built to elevate homes above seasonal waters. Others were monumental, rising more than 10 meters high and covering several hectares. These larger mounds served as centers of settlement, ceremonial grounds, and cemeteries. To imagine the labor involved is to picture generations moving soil basket by basket, shaping platforms and terraces in a landscape that constantly shifted beneath them. Upon these mounds stood villages, organized and enduring, houses, likely, made of wood and palm thatch, circled plazas where daily life unfolded. Imagine walking across one of these plazas at dawn. Smoke curls from cooking fires, and families prepare manioc flour, the staple of the diet. Children run across wooden walkways connecting houses. In the distance, fishers push canoes into floodwaters, while others tend gardens planted on raised ground. This was not a scattered life of chance, but a coordinated adaptation to environment. And then there is the pottery, the most striking expression of Mariora culture. Excavated vessels, bowls, and urns reveal elaborate designs painted in red, black, and white. Spirals, faces, and animal forms wrap around their surfaces with a boldness that speaks across centuries. Some are so intricate that modern archaeologists still puzzle over their symbolic meanings. The funerary urns, often used to hold the remains of the dead, are especially striking, large, ornate, and personalized. They seem to embody the blending of art, ritual, and daily life. You can almost feel the presence of the artisans, shaping clay with patience, painting with steady hands, creating objects meant to endure. These objects remind you that even in environments deemed difficult, art flourishes. Life on Marasho was not only about survival, it was about expression, belief, and identity. To hold a Marajor pot is to glimpse a worldview where humans, animals, and spirits flow together in continuous patterns. But daily survival still required ingenuity. The Mariora engineered fisheries by digging ponds and canals, creating environments where fish could be trapped during floods and harvested later. They understood the rhythms of water and transformed them into systems of abundance. Alongside manioc cultivation, this provided stability for large populations. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of people may have lived on the island at its peak, organized into communities connected by waterways and kinship. You realize now that what outsiders once dismissed as wilderness was in fact a cultural landscape. The Mariora did not conquer the island so much as they choreographed life with it. Their mounds rose as counterpoints to floods. Their canals turned water's unpredictability into opportunity. Their art translated belief into form. In every sense, they built a city, though not a city of stone, but one of earth, water, and clay. Yet for all their ingenuity, their story faded. By the time Europeans arrived in the region in the 16th century, the great mounds had already been abandoned. Populations had declined, perhaps due to shifting environmental pressures, internal changes, or the ripple effects of diseases sweeping through the Americas. The memory of the Marajora lived on only in fragments, pottery shards scattered in fields, earthworks hidden beneath vegetation, whispers of ancestors among indigenous descendants. For centuries afterward, cattle ranches spread across Marajo Island. The great mounds became grazing grounds. Pottery was dug up, not for study, but as curiosities or obstacles to plowing. Scholars who did notice the artifacts often misattributed them, preferring fantasies of lost white civilizations to the truth. of indigenous achievement. Only slowly, through decades of archaeological research, has the story begun to be restored. Excavations revealed the scale of the mounds and the richness of the pottery. Studies of fish ponds and soil confirmed sophisticated subsistence strategies. Bit by bit, the forgotten city of Marajo re-emerged, not as myth, but as reality. And so, you find yourself here, listening to the story unfold. A vast river island that seemed empty was once a place of tens of thousands, living in organized settlements, shaping earth and water to their will. Their lives may seem ordinary, even boring in the details of farming, fishing, and pottery making. But those very details, measured in soil, clay, and fish bones, are what gave them endurance for centuries. The question lingers as this section draws to a close. If a city could rise on an island of floods and then be forgotten beneath cattle pastures, how many other cities lie erased, not by conquest, but by neglect, waiting silently for us to notice them again? You return to the island of Marajo, but now the quiet landscape feels layered with unseen voices. The cattle grazing on grassy plains, the rivers winding through marshes, all of it rests on ground once sculpted by human labor. It is easy to miss, unless you know what to look for. A mound rising just slightly higher than the floodplain. Pottery shards scattered by the roots of a tree, or faint depressions hinting at forgotten canals. The work of archaeologists here is not glamorous. It involves hours of surveying, troweling through damp soil, and recording fragments of broken vessels. Yet each fragment, each line in the ground, slowly reconstructs a world once bustling with activity. For you, listening now, the story unfolds not in sudden revelations, but in the patient layering of details, just as the Maraora themselves built their mounds, basket by basket, year by year. One of the most striking features of the Maraora settlements are the mound complexes. Some mounds were modest platforms, lifting family homes above the floodwaters. Others were monumental, rising more than 10 meters. These were not simple piles of earth, but carefully engineered structures, built in phases and expanded across generations. Excavations show layers of fill, interspersed with living surfaces, evidence that communities returned again and again to the same sites, reinforcing and enlarging them. On top of these mounds, villages formed with striking organization. Houses, arranged in circles or rows, surrounded central plazas, where daily life gathered. The plazas were not empty spaces, but stages for ritual and social interaction. Here, ceremonies might unfold, disputes might be resolved, and leaders might speak to their communities. To imagine the bustle of a Maraora plaza is to hear the voices of traders arriving by canoe, artisans shaping clay, children chasing each other in the dust, and elders watching from shaded doorways. The pottery remains the most eloquent voice of this forgotten city. The Maraora ceramic tradition is one of the most elaborate in the Americas. Large funerary urns, sometimes taller than a person, were painted and incised with bold patterns. Stylized human figures, animals, and geometric motifs wrapped around their surfaces. Some vessels depict female forms with pronounced hips and bellies, perhaps linked to fertility cults. Others carry serpent or bird motifs, suggesting connections to myths and spiritual beliefs. Holding such an urn today, you would feel both artistry and intimacy. These were not objects made in haste. They were carefully crafted, fired, and painted for ceremonial purposes, often to house the remains of the dead. In this way, Pottery was more than utility, was memory, connecting the living with ancestors. Yet pottery was not only funerary. Everyday cooking pots, bowls, and jars also carried decoration, albeit simpler. This tells you something essential. In Marayora culture, art was not confined to elite spaces. It permeated daily life, turning ordinary objects into vessels of identity. Imagine sitting down to a meal where even the simplest bowl carried a painted spiral linking you to a broader worldview. Food itself required complex systems. Manioc remained central, but its preparation was labor-intensive. Root tubers were peeled, grated, soaked, and roasted into flour, removing toxins in the process. This flour became the base for breads and porridges. Alongside manioc, fish provided protein, sustained through ingenious systems of fish weirs and ponds. Archaeologists have traced these aquaculture systems across the island. Ditches and embankments designed to trap fish during floods, ensuring reliable harvests as waters receded. Together, these systems allowed populations to grow. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands, perhaps more, lived on Marajo Island at its peak. To you, this is striking. A river island, subject to floods and isolation, sustaining populations comparable to medieval towns in Europe. And yet, while those towns left cathedrals and chronicles, Marajo's people left earthworks and pottery. Fragile in the eyes of time, leadership likely emerged within this scale of society. The effort required to build mounds, organize fisheries, and coordinate ritual life suggests hierarchies of some form. Some archaeologists argue that Marayora society was stratified, with elites directing labor and enjoying prestige expressed in elaborate burial urns. Others emphasize community cooperation, seeing the mounds as collective achievements. The truth may lie somewhere between, hierarchy tempered by the necessity of shared survival in a challenging environment. Still, not all was harmonious. Evidence of fortifications, palisades, and weapons suggests that conflict was part of life. Rival groups may have competed for resources, or disputes over leadership may have escalated into violence. Yet even this conflict reminds you that Marajo was not marginal. It was a vibrant, contested place where people struggled, organized, and dreamed, just as in any other center of civilization. What makes the Marayora story particularly poignant is how quickly it was forgotten. By the time Europeans reached the region, the great mounds were already abandoned. The reasons remain debated. Some scholars suggest environmental pressures perhaps. The fisheries or soils that had sustained the population eventually reached limits. Others point to internal social change, shifts in leadership, or migration. Still others argue that epidemic diseases sweeping through the Americas in the wake of European contact reached Marajo indirectly, collapsing populations before Europeans ever set foot on the island. Whatever the cause, by the 1500s, the mounds were silent. Forests and grasses crept over them. Without stone walls or written records, memory faded quickly. For centuries, locals found pottery fragments in fields and treated them as curiosities. Scholars speculated wildly, some imagining Phoenician colonists or Atlantean refugees. They could not imagine that indigenous Amazonians had created such complexity. This bias, perhaps more than the floods or diseases, erased Marajo from history's stage. It was only in the 20th century, with systematic excavation, that the truth emerged. Brazilian archaeologist Betty Megas played a major role in early studies of Marajo, though her conclusions were cautious, emphasizing limits of Amazonian environments. Later, scholars challenged these limits, showing that the Marajora had not merely survived, but thrived, adapting the landscape with creativity and resilience. Today, the island is recognized as one of the great centers of pre-Columbian civilization in South America, yet the recognition remains partial. Outside specialist circles, Marajo is little known. Few textbooks mention it, and fewer still describe the daily life of its people. To most, it is invisible, an island of cattle, not an island of mounds. You might even visit today and walk across a mound without realizing its significance. And perhaps that is the most boring part of this history. Greatness hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary landscape. As you drift with this thought, you wonder, why do we remember some civilizations and forget others? Is it the presence of stone, the survival of writing, the luck of geography? Or is it simply a matter of whose story was convenient to preserve? And so this section closes with an unresolved reflection. If Marajo could once support tens of thousands in a city-like society and then vanish from memory, how many other forgotten cities lie beneath the surface of ordinary landscapes, waiting for us to see them? You picture Marajo once more, but now the scene is quieter. The great mounds that once supported villages are overgrown with grass. The plazas, where families gathered and leaders spoke, are silent. Canoes no longer cut across. The marshes and the intricate fisheries lie silted beneath stagnant water. What remains is landscaper, broad island at the mouth of the Amazon, seemingly ordinary. Yet beneath its soil lies the memory of a city that was once alive, the end of the Mariora. Culture did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. There was no invading army to burn villages, no monumental temple collapsing in fire. Instead, the decline seems to have been gradual, shaped by a combination of pressures. Environmental change may have played a role. Wetlands can shift unpredictably, and fisheries, once abundant, may have faltered. Social shifts within the communities may have contributed, as leadership structures strained or rituals lost cohesion. And above all, the indirect arrival of European diseases, spreading invisibly through trade and travel across the Americas, likely devastated populations before Europeans even arrived on the island. By the time outsiders encountered Marajo in the 16th century, the great mounds were already abandoned. The survivors' indigenous groups living in smaller, scattered communities carried fragments of knowledge, but the memory of the great centers had faded. Without stone monuments or written chronicles, there was little to remind later generations of the complexity that had once flourished here. And so, Marajo's story entered obscurity. For centuries, the island was known more for its cattle ranches than for its ancient past. Pottery shards unearthed by farmers were curiosities, not keys to history. Scholars, when they noticed the mounds at all, often misattributed them, imagining that only distant civilizations could have built such structures. The assumption that the Amazon was incapable of supporting complex societies lingered stubbornly. Rediscovery came not through sudden revelation, but through decades of slow, careful excavation. Archaeologists pieced together the evidence. Layers of mound construction, elaborate pottery traditions, fisheries designed to capture seasonal abundance. Each discovery added weight to the argument that Marajo was not peripheral but central to understanding Amazonian history. The pottery became central to this recognition. When you see a Mariora urn with its sweeping designs and bold figures, you realize that artistry flourished here with as much sophistication as in any well-known civilization. The urns speak of beliefs in fertility, in spirits, in the cycle of life and death. They remind you that even in an environment outsiders thought hostile, people created beauty and meaning that lasted centuries. Yet the rediscovery of Morajo has also forced archaeologists and historians to confront uncomfortable truths. For too long, indigenous peoples were underestimated. Their achievements were denied or explained away. Even now, the story of Morajo is little known outside specialist circles. This silence reflects not just the fragility of wooden houses and earth mounds, but also the biases of those who decided what counted as civilization. You realize that Morajo challenges the very definition of civilization. For centuries, the word was tied to stone monuments, writing systems, and metalwork. By that measure, Morajo seemed invisible. But if you define civilization instead as the ability to adapt, to organize, to create art, and to sustain large populations, then Morajo was undeniably one. Its people engineered soil, water, and society to thrive in an unpredictable environment. They left behind not stone temples but living landscapes, orchards, canals, and mounds that reshaped the island. What lessons linger from this forgotten city? One is resilience. The Marayora people transformed a floodplain into a home for tens of thousands. Their fisheries, gardens, and mounds reveal ingenuity that modern societies still study. Another lesson is fragility. A culture that endured for centuries could decline rapidly under pressures beyond its control. And finally, there is the lesson of memory. Without durable monuments or written records, Morajo vanished from the world's awareness for centuries, its achievements buried not just under soil, but under indifference today. Archaeologists, historians, and indigenous communities are working to bring the story back. Excavations continue. New technologies reveal patterns once invisible, and local voices remind us that the island's past is not entirely lost. Pottery fragments become threads in a tapestry that is being Each shard, each mound, each ditch is a reminder that civilization does not only belong to stone builders and empire makers. You sit with this thought as the story draws to a close. Morajo was a city of earth, water, and clay. It rose quietly, thrived for centuries, and disappeared without fanfare. Its silence misled generations into thinking there was nothing there. But the soil remembers, and the fragments endure. And so the story leaves you with a reflection. If an entire civilization can rise and vanish without leaving monuments of stone, how many other cities of earth, wood, and memory have been lost? To time, and how many still wait, hidden in plain sight, for us to listen more carefully to the ground beneath our feet. Story 3. Pottery shards that whisper of a vanished people. You imagine yourself walking along a muddy riverbank after the water has receded. The soil is soft, littered with roots and stones. But as you look closer, you notice a shard of pottery. Its curve smooth, its surface faintly decorated with red paint. To anyone else, it might appear as nothing more than broken clay, but to an archaeologist or to you, listening now, it is a fragment of memory, a voice from people long gone. Pottery is among the most durable of human creations. Wood rots, cloth decays, even metal rusts away, but fired clay persists. That is why so much of what we know about ancient peoples comes not from monuments or chronicles, but from fragments of pots, bowls, and jars. In the Amazon, where humidity devours almost everything, pottery shards are often the only trace of entire communities. They are, in a way, the whispers of a vanished people. Imagine life in a small settlement centuries ago. Families gathered around a hearth, shaping clay from riverbanks into vessels. They mixed in ash or crushed shells to temper the clay, then coiled and smoothed it into form. Simple pots were fired in open fires, turning them durable enough for daily use. Larger vessels were painted with pigments, their surfaces adorned with spirals, animal figures, or geometric lines. Some carried symbolic meanings, others were simply pleasing to the eye. These pots held food and water, but they also carried culture. A cooking pot is more than a tool, it reflects diet, technology, and tradition. The decoration on a jar tells you about aesthetics and belief. A burial urn tells you about attitudes toward death and ancestors. Pottery, though humble, reveals the fabric of daily life in ways no monument can. On Marajo Island, as you've already seen, the Marajo culture produced some of the most elaborate pottery in the Americas. Large urns, brightly painted and incised with complex designs, still astonish archaeologists today. But they are not alone. Across the Amazon basin, countless groups created pottery traditions, each distinct yet connected in the upper Xingu. Vessels carried designs tied to ritual feasting. Along the Madeira River, pottery with sharp angles and bold patterns suggests interaction with Andean cultures. In the Tupperhose region, near the modern city of Santarém, elaborate urns and figurines reveal yet another tradition, blending local and foreign styles. You may think of these shards as puzzle pieces. Each is incomplete, but together they sketch a picture of societies that thrived where outsiders once assumed only wilderness. Archaeologists carefully record each fragment, its curvature, thickness, decoration. They sort them into typologies, tracing how styles changed across centuries. A shift in paint color or rim shape might suggest migration, influence, or innovation. In this way, broken pots become timelines. The details may feel boring, scraping soil layer by layer, cataloging endless fragments, comparing rim angles under dim lab light. But it is through this slow work that the voices of vanished people re-emerge. A shard with traces of soot tells you it once sat on a hearth, simmering manioc stew. Another, painted with spirals, hints at a symbolic system now lost. Together, they tell you that these people did not merely survive in the Amazon, they created, adapted, and expressed themselves in ways as rich as any known civilization. There is also a social side to pottery. The making of a pot was often communal. Women, in many Amazonian societies, were the primary potters. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter, shaping traditions that lasted centuries. The act of making pottery bound generations together. And so, when you hold a shard today, you are not only holding clay, you are holding the touch of someone's hands, preserved across centuries. Consider also how pottery linked the living with the dead. Funerary urns often contained cremated remains, placed carefully in decorated vessels and buried in mounds. To bury a loved one in such a pot was to surround them with art, to send them into the afterlife with protection and memory. When archaeologists excavate these urns, they uncover not just artifacts, but the echoes of grief and reverence. The patterns painted on the urns whisper of beliefs that guided entire communities. And yet, pottery is fragile. It breaks easily, scattering into shards. That is why archaeologists so often find fragments, never whole vessels. But in that fragility lies endurance. A shattered pot can still speak centuries later, when houses and gardens are gone. you begin to realize that history itself is often reconstructed from such fragments. We rarely get complete stories. Instead, we piece together the past from what remains. A shard of pottery, though silent, can whisper louder than a monument because it speaks of ordinary life. It tells you not only how people built, but how they ate, how they buried, how they remembered. As you drift deeper into this thought, you sense the quiet persistence of these objects. They are not spectacular in the way of pyramids or castles, but they are steady, enduring reminders of human presence. And they lead you to ask, if so much of a civilization can vanish, yet its memory endure in something as humble as broken clay, what other small fragments around us carry the weight of forgotten worlds? You imagine an archaeologist crouched over a shallow pit, brushing away soil to reveal the curve of a ceramic rim. Around them, the air is heavy with humidity, insects buzz, and the slow rhythm of excavation continues. What emerges is not treasure in the sense of gold or jewels, but treasure nonetheless, a fragment of fired clay that once held food, water, or memory. In the Amazon, these shards are often the most tangible evidence of entire societies. Wood rots quickly in the heat and rain. Fabrics disappear in months. Even bones dissolve in the acidic soils. But pottery remains. It is through this endurance that the past becomes visible again. To you, listening now, this may feel repetitive, almost dull, shard after shard, catalogued, measured, drawn. And yet, each piece adds a line to the silent story of vanished peoples. One of the first things archaeologists notice about pottery is style. A shard with red and black painted spirals might come from the Mariora culture. Another, with fine incised lines, could belong to the Santarem tradition. A thick-walled, undecorated fragment may reflect everyday cooking ware, while a thin, carefully painted piece might have been reserved for ritual. Styles shift over time, and by tracing these shifts, archaeologists construct chronologies. In this way, broken pottery becomes a kind of calendar, marking centuries of change. But pottery also reveals connections. In the Tapajos region near Santarem, vessels show influences from the Andes, hundreds of kilometers away. Designs resembling mountain motifs suggest trade or cultural exchange across vast distances. Along the Madeira River, archaeologists have found ceramics with shapes resembling those of faraway groups, evidence that the Amazon was not isolated, but part of broader networks. Pottery was portable pots carried food and water, but they also carried ideas. Imagine traders paddling downriver, their canoes loaded with jars of manioc beer. As they arrived in another settlement, they shared not only drink but also designs. Local potters, seeing a new motif, might adapt it into their own traditions. Over generations, the exchange of pots became the exchange of culture. In this way, a shard unearthed today may carry within it echoes of journeys taken centuries ago. There is also the question of technology. The composition of pottery, what temper was used, how it was fired tells you about knowledge systems. Some groups used crushed shells to strengthen clay, others used sand or ash. The choice affected durability, weight, and appearance. Even the firing method varied. Open fires produced different colors and textures than in closed kilns. By analyzing these traces, archaeologists reconstruct not only what pots looked like, but how they were made. Through this, you begin to see the ordinary routines of life. Women gathering clay at the riverbank, families sitting together, shaping vessels while telling stories, children learning by imitation, their first small pots, clumsy but cherished. These everyday acts, repeated across centuries, shaped traditions strong enough to be recognized even now. Long after the names of the potters are forgotten, pottery also reveals the diet of vanished peoples. Residues left inside pots can be analyzed, sometimes preserving traces of starch or fat. These analyzers show what foods were cooked: manioc, maize, fish, perhaps even fruits. Burn marks on the base of pots tell you that they sat directly on hearth fires, blackened by years of use. In this way, shards become cookbooks of the past, filled not with recipes but with faint chemical signatures of meals once shared. Even rituals speak through pottery. Burial urns, often elaborately decorated, contained cremated remains. They were placed carefully within mounds, sometimes alongside offerings of smaller vessels or figurines. The designs on these urn spirals, animals, human faces, were not random. They symbolized beliefs about death, fertility, and the connection between the living and the spirit world. To excavate such an urn is to witness an intimate moment, a family honoring their dead, sending them into the afterlife surrounded by beauty. You might think about how fragile pottery is, and yet how enduring. A pot breaks in a moment, shattered by accident, but the pieces can last for millennia. A whole city may vanish, its houses dissolved into the soil, yet its pottery remains, scattered across fields. This paradox, the fragility of the object, the endurance of the fragment, becomes a metaphor for history itself. Civilizations crumble, but their fragments persist. Archaeologists often speak of middens refuse, heaps where discarded pottery, bones, and ashes accumulated. To outsiders, these might look like nothing but trash, but to researchers, they are archives. A midden filled with broken pots shows patterns of daily consumption, feasting, or ritual. Over time, layers build up, each one a chapter in the life of a community. Some middens in the Amazon contain thousands of shards, spanning centuries. Cataloging them may seem tedious, but each entry adds detail. A slight change in rim shape here, a new painting style that all contribute to understanding how societies evolved. From trash heaps emerge histories of migration, adaptation, and belief, and yet, even with all this evidence, so much remains unknowable. The designs painted on Mariora urns, the spirals carved into Tapajos figurines, what exactly did they mean? Scholars speculate about fertility, cosmology, shamanic visions, but without written records, certainty remains out of reach. You are left with whispers, patterns that speak but do not explain themselves fully. Perhaps this is fitting. Pottery, after all, is the voice of the ordinary. It was made by many hands, used in countless daily acts, and discarded when broken. Its survival is accidental, not intentional. Unlike monuments built to impress, pottery endures because it was too common to preserve, too humble to be valued by later generations. And yet, in its ordinariness lies truth. It tells you not about kings or battles, but about meals, rituals, and lives. As you reflect on this, the thought emerges quietly. If we judge history by what survives, are we listening to the voices of the powerful or to the fragments of the ordinary that whisper from the ground? You picture again that single shard lying in the soil. It is small, fragile, and silent, yet in it lies the trace of a vanished life. Multiply it by thousands, and you begin to sense the scale. Broken pots scattered across riversides, floodplains, and abandoned mounds, each one a piece of a story. Pottery shards, humble and overlooked, become the most enduring storytellers of human history. The persistence of pottery is not accidental. It emerges from a paradox. Clay is fragile when whole, but nearly indestructible when broken. A vessel can shatter in an instant, but its fragments endure for centuries. This is why archaeologists so often find only pieces. A complete pot is rare, but shards are everywhere, like echoes spread across the land. They become, in a sense, the archives of forgotten civilizations. Consider how much of Amazonian history is reconstructed from such fragments. Without writing systems, without stone monuments, the people who lived here left behind few durable markers. Yet through pottery, their presence is undeniable. Each shard shows that people lived here, cooked here, buried their dead here. The repetition of fragments across sites tells you that these were not scattered bands of survival, but societies with traditions, technologies, and shared meanings. The art on pottery speaks across time. Spirals may echo cycles of life and death. Stylized birds or snakes may point to myths now forgotten. Human figures carved on urns may have represented deities, ancestors, or symbolic roles. Though the exact meanings slip beyond reach, the effort invested in decoration tells you that art mattered. Even in daily tools, aesthetics carried weight. These were not people scraping by. They had time and energy to create beauty. The distribution of pottery also tells stories of movement. A style found in one region but echoed in another suggests travel, trade, or migration. When archaeologists map pottery styles, they often find overlapping zones of influence, like ripples spreading across rivers. In this way, shards trace the invisible highways of ancient peoples, showing connections between distant communities. Even function reveals humanity. Large storage jars speak of abundance, of harvests stored for lean times. Small bowls suggest meals shared in households. Drinking vessels hint at communal feasting or ritual. Funerary urns speak of reverence for the dead, of societies that cared for memory as much as survival. Each piece is a clue, not only about how people lived, but about how they thought and believed. And yet, pottery shards also embody silence. They tell you what existed, but rarely why. You can hold a fragment painted with intricate lines, but you cannot ask the potter what it meant. You can analyze residues of manioc beer inside a jar, but you cannot taste the flavors as the people once did. The shards whisper, but they do not shout. They give you fragments, not full stories. Perhaps that is why they feel so powerful. They remind you that history is always incomplete, always reconstructed from partial evidence. The lives of ordinary people rarely leave behind monuments or texts, but their tools and pots endure. To listen to pottery shards is to listen to the faint voices of those who lived outside the spotlight of power. There is a humility in this. Civilizations may rise with grandeur, but their stories often collapse into fragments. The Amazonian peoples left no pyramids, no stone tablets, no chronicles, and yet their shards still speak. They tell you that survival was possible here, that culture flourished, that beauty was created. They correct the old myth of wilderness, showing instead a mosaic of vibrant societies. Modern archaeologists continue to piece together these voices. In labs, specialists analyze microscopic residues on pottery, revealing diets. In museums, fragments are catalogued by style, linking sites across vast distances. In the field, each new excavation adds to the growing picture of Amazonian complexity. Slowly, patiently, a narrative emerges of emptiness. but of presence. For indigenous descendants, these shards carry even deeper meaning. They are not just scientific data, but ancestral objects. They embody continuity, even if cultural ruptures severed specific traditions. Some communities see in the pottery the tangible presence of forebears, a reminder that their people have always been part of the Amazon's story. In this way, archaeology and memory intertwine. And so you sit with the thought, pottery shards are the humblest of artifacts, yet among the most enduring. They whisper not of kings or battles, but of meals, rituals, and beliefs. They remind you that civilizations are not only measured by monuments, but by the persistence of the ordinary dot. As the story of shards closes, you are left with a quiet question. If fragments of clay can carry the voices of vanished peoples for centuries, what fragments of our own lives will endure, and what will they whisper to those who come after us? Story 4. The Amazonian roads that led nowhere. You close your eyes and imagine standing in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. Around you, the air is thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth. Vines twist between towering trees, insects hum, and the canopy blocks much of the sky. To your eyes, it seems like a wilderness without order, a tangle of roots and leaves stretching endlessly. And yet, beneath this canopy, hidden by centuries of growth, lies something that feels impossible. Straight lines. The Amazon is not a place where nature favors order. Rivers twist in wide meanders, streams cut crooked paths, and the forest grows in chaotic abundance. But in the last few decades, archaeologists, using satellite images and LiDAR surveys, have revealed vast stretches of geometric roads, perfectly straight, stretching for kilometers, cutting through hills and valleys with a precision that defies the landscape. They appear like scars beneath the trees, or like lines drawn on an ancient map that no one remembered existed. These roads are the legacy of societies long vanished. To you, they may seem unremarkable at first. A ditch here, a raised embankment there, but when traced across the land, they form a network. Some run for dozens of kilometers, connecting circular enclosures, villages, and ceremonial spaces. Others form geometric patterns, squares, circles, and intersecting lines etched into the earth. Together, they reveal that the forest was once crisscrossed by pathways that did not follow the rivers, but cut directly across them. Imagine the effort involved. To carve a straight road through dense forest, people had to clear trees, dig ditches, and pile earth into embankments. They had to maintain these paths against floods and growth. This was not the work of scattered bands. It required coordination, vision, and labor. It was, in its own way, urban planning, though made not of stone but of soil. Archaeologists still debate the function of these roads. Some may have been practical, linking villages for trade and communication. Others appear ceremonial, connecting plazas or earthworks aligned to the sun. The precision of their geometry suggests more than chance. To walk down such a road centuries ago would have been to follow a line of meaning, a path connecting communities, both physically and spiritually. You might picture a procession moving along one of these raised roads, villagers carrying baskets of food, musicians playing drums and flutes, leaders adorned with feathers and paint. They walk not through wilderness, but along a well-defined path, heading toward a plaza where rituals will unfold. The road, straight and unwavering, guides them through forest and floodplain alike, reminding them that their community was part of something larger from the air. These roads appear haunting. LiDAR images show them as faint lines glowing beneath, the canopy leading to enclosures shaped like squares and circles. They look almost like messages carved into the earth, visible only when the forest is stripped away. For centuries, no one knew they were there. Farmers occasionally stumbled upon ditches or embankments, but the scale remained invisible until satellites revealed it. For you, the significance is clear. These roads prove that the Amazon was not an untouched wilderness. It was mapped, organized, and traversed by societies who thought in straight lines and geometric forms. They imposed order on a landscape that outsiders assumed was chaotic. The roads tell you that people here not only adapted to the forest, but reshaped it with intention. And yet, the mystery deepens. Many of these roads seem to lead nowhere. They stretch 4 kilometers, then fade into forest with no clear destination. Archaeologists suggest that the settlements they once connected may have been abandoned or erased by time. Perhaps they led to villages now swallowed by soil, or to ceremonial centers forgotten when populations declined. The roads remain, but their destinations are gone. This creates a strange feeling. To walk one of these roads today is to follow a path into silence. You see the embankments rising slightly above the forest floor, the straightness persisting despite centuries of erosion. But instead of bustling villages at the end, you find only trees, vines, and the hum of insects. The road continues into nothing, a line of memory that no longer connects. Daily life along these roads must have been ordinary and extraordinary at once. Farmers carrying manioc flour to neighboring villages, families visiting relatives, traders moving pottery or feathers all used the paths for practical reasons. But the roads also shaped imagination. Their straightness, their alignment, suggested meaning. They may have been seen as pathways linking not just people, but also spirits, ancestors, or celestial patterns. The story of these roads is not one of grandeur in the traditional sense. There are no towering arches, no triumphal gates. Instead, there are embankments barely a meter high, running stubbornly straight through forest. They do not impress at first glance, but when traced across kilometers, they whisper of a vanished order. They tell you that people once thought of space differently, imposing geometry on wilderness. And so, as you listen now, you realize that these roads are more than infrastructure. They are metaphors. They represent the desire to connect, to impose meaning, to find order in a chaotic world. Even if their destinations are lost, their presence endures, reminding us that people once walked with purpose where now only trees stand. The section closes with a question that lingers in your mind. If roads once stretched across the Amazon, only to vanish into silence, what other paths of history have we lost, lines drawn by human hands that now lead nowhere, waiting for us to notice their faint traces beneath the surface? You return to the forest in your imagination, but now you see it not as wild disorder, but as a map drawn on the ground. The lines are faint embankments, rising no higher than your knees, ditches half filled with centuries of soil. Yet when archaeologists connect these fragments on a map, the scale becomes astonishing. Dozens of straight lines intersect, forming grids radiating outward from circular enclosures, linking sites across vast distances. The discovery of these roads has been slow, built piece by piece. In the 1970s and 1980s, farmers clearing land in Acre, a state in western Brazil, reported strange earthworks, ditches forming squares and circles, and long embankments stretching into the distance. For decades, they were thought to be isolated curiosities, But with the arrival of aerial photography and satellite imagery, patterns emerged. By the 2000s, LiDAR scans confirmed what some had long suspected. The Amazon once contained an entire network of roads and earthworks, carefully planned and executed. The construction was deceptively simple. Workers dug ditches, piling the soil into embankments that marked the edges of roads. These embankments could be 1 to 3 meters wide, stretching in unnervingly straight lines. Some ran for several kilometers, ignoring the curves of rivers and hills. Archaeologists note that such precision required surveying skills and organized labor. These were not casual paths trampled into the forest by hunters. They were engineered with intention. To walk such a road centuries ago would have been a communal experience. Picture villagers carrying baskets of manioc flour, traders hauling pottery and feathers, or processions heading to a ritual plaza. The straightness of the road guided them, a visible reminder of connection across the forest. In an environment where rivers twist unpredictably, these lines provided certainty. They told people where they were going, and perhaps who they were connected to. The cultural meaning of these roads remains debated. Some archaeologists argue they were practical, linking communities for trade, marriage alliances, and social gatherings. Others see them as ceremonial, designed to connect sacred spaces. The geometry of certain road networks suggests cosmological significance. A road aligned to the sunrise at solstice, or to a prominent hill, may have carried spiritual meaning as much as practical value. The roads also reveal something about social organization. Their construction would have required cooperation among hundreds of people. Trees had to be cleared, soil dug and piled, lines surveyed. This suggests leadership, whether in the form of chiefs, councils, or shared traditions that could mobilize labor for collective projects. In this sense, the roads were not only pathways but also statements of community, power, and identity. What makes them haunting today is how many appear to lead nowhere. Archaeologists trace them across the land, only to find them fade into forest without a clear endpoint. In some cases, the settlements they once connected have vanished, leaving only faint traces in soil. In others, the roads may have ended at ceremonial spaces now hidden by trees. The mystery deepens. Were they abandoned suddenly, or did they gradually lose meaning as populations declined? One theory is that the great depopulation following European contact left the roads orphaned. As diseases swept through the Americas, communities collapsed. Without people to maintain them, roads quickly eroded, swallowed by vegetation. In the humid Amazon, even monumental works can vanish in a few centuries. Another theory suggests that social change within these cultures led to abandonment, shifts in ritual, migration, or conflict that made roads obsolete. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Lines once filled with life now stretch into silence. For archaeologists, the study of these roads is slow and often frustrating. LiDAR images reveal patterns, but interpretation requires ground surveys. Excavating an embankment may reveal little more than soil and charcoal, signs of fires once lit nearby. Yet these small details matter. A fragment of pottery embedded in a roadbed shows that people carried vessels along it. Charcoal from post holes suggests palisades or markers once stood along the way. Piece by piece, the picture grows clearer. To you, this may sound monotonous. Even dull measuring embankments, recording soil layers, cataloging pottery shards. And yet, This is how history is rebuilt. The grandeur of the roads is not in dramatic ruins, but in their persistence. The fact that faint lines survive at all after centuries of abandonment is remarkable. They remind you that people once carved meaning into this landscape, even if most of it has faded. The roads also challenge the old myth of Amazonian wilderness. For centuries, outsiders believed the forest was untouched, a natural paradise, unshaped by humans. The discovery of these roads proves otherwise. They show that people imposed order here, connecting communities across distances, building networks as real as those of stone empires elsewhere. The Amazon was not empty. It was mapped and inhabited, its landscape shaped by human intention. You might pause here and consider how roads define civilizations. The Romans built stone roads that still exist today. The Inca carved trails across the Andes. In the Amazon, roads were made of earth, more vulnerable to time. And yet, they served the same purpose: to connect, to organize, to remind people of their shared world. The difference is only in what survives. As this section draws to a close, you are left with a lingering question. If so many Amazonian roads now lead nowhere, are we walking through history, blind, missing the paths that once defined entire worlds, hidden beneath the very forests we assume are eternal? You imagine standing at the edge of one of these ancient roads. It stretches straight ahead, a faint ridge running through the forest. Its once proud embankments now softened by centuries of rain and roots. Birds nest where travelers once walked. Roots pierce the soil where once baskets of manioc or jars of fish stew were carried in procession. It feels both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it is just earth and grass now. Extraordinary because it holds the memory of thousands of footsteps that once gave it meaning. The silence of these roads speaks volumes. They remind you that civilizations often vanish, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Unlike the collapse of empires, chronicled in stone inscriptions, the societies of the Amazon left behind fragile legacies. Wooden houses rotted, mounds eroded, rituals faded, and the roads, once the lifelines of connection, slowly dissolved. Into the soil, archaeologists piece together the story, but the final chapter remains elusive. Why were these roads abandoned? Perhaps the great waves of disease that followed European contact emptied villages, leaving roads unused. Perhaps shifting climates or resource pressures strained systems, leading communities to move or fragment. Or perhaps new patterns of belief made the old ceremonial routes obsolete. The answers remain partial, and so the roads end not only in forest but in mystery, yet rediscovery has given them new life. From the air, satellites and LiDAR surveys show their geometry glowing beneath the trees. What once seemed random clearings are revealed as nodes in a network. Straight lines, circles, and intersections appear like a script written into the land. Archaeologists walk these faint traces and realize they are walking the remnants of a civilization erased from memory. The meaning of these roads lies not only in their construction, but in what they represent. Roads are more than infrastructure. They are statements of connection. To build a road is to declare a bond between two places, to affirm that movement, exchange, and unity matter. The Amazonian roads remind you that the people here were not isolated tribes in wilderness. They were communities linked by intention, ritual, and trade. Their roads prove that they thought in straight lines, in geometry, in networks. What makes them haunting is that so many lead nowhere today. The plazas they once connected are gone, the villages erased. To follow them is to follow a line into absence. And yet, that absence itself is powerful. It forces you to recognize the fragility of memory. Without stone or writing, entire networks can disappear, leaving only faint ridges beneath trees. Daily life along these roads is easy to imagine. Families carrying goods to a neighboring settlement, elders traveling to ceremonial gatherings, traders bringing pottery, feathers, or foods across regions, children running ahead on paths that seemed endless. Each journey gave the road meaning, embedding it with human presence. Today, the forest has swallowed that presence, but the traces remain as quiet testimony. These roads also challenge how we define civilization. For centuries, scholars judged societies by stone architecture, writing, or metallurgy. By those standards, the Amazon seemed empty, but the roads prove otherwise. They show large-scale planning, cooperation, and vision. They prove the people here built not only villages, but regional systems, linked by geometry and ritual. Civilization was not absent, it was simply built in earth instead of stone. Perhaps the most striking lesson of these roads is how history can be hidden in plain sight. For centuries, farmers plowed fields on top of embankments without realizing their significance. Travelers walked over ditches thinking them natural. Only when new technologies revealed the full patterns did we begin to see. This raises an unsettling thought. How much of history lies beneath our feet, invisible simply because we do not yet know how to look? Modern archaeologists now map and preserve these sites, but they face challenges. Roads cut through by highways, mounds flattened for cattle pasture, ditches eroded by modern drainage hole threaten what remains. The fragility of earthworks reminds us that the past can vanish quickly if not cared for. And so you reflect. The Amazonian roads are not only relics of the past, but also mirrors for the present. They remind us that civilizations can be forgotten if their traces are too humble to impress. They warn us that absence in the historical record does not mean absence in reality. They invite us to expand our definition of civilization, to recognize resilience in forms other than stone and writing. The story closes with a quiet image, a straight line cutting through forest, leading into silence. You cannot see where it ends, but you know it once connected lives, rituals, and dreams. And so you are left with a lingering thought. If roads that once bound communities together can vanish into wilderness, how many of our own connections, our own networks, will survive the centuries, or will they, too, become roads that lead nowhere? Story 5. The fish traps of a silent river. You picture the Amazon River at dawn. The mist clings low to the water, and the current moves slowly, almost lazily, as if gathering strength for the day. Birds call from unseen branches, and the hum of insects begins to rise. Along the river's edge, you notice faint ridges in the soil, shallow ditches, and scattered wooden stakes poking up from the mud. To most eyes, they are nothing, swallowed by time and erosion. But to archaeologists and to you now listening, they are the remnants of one of the most ingenious survival systems ever devised in the Amazon. Fish traps. Life in the Amazon has always revolved around water. Rivers flood and retreat with the seasons, shaping every aspect of existence. They give abundance and take it away with equal force. For centuries, scholars assumed that large populations could not thrive here because the rivers were too unpredictable, the soils too poor, the floods too destructive. Yet the people who lived here developed strategies that turned the apparent chaos of water into stability. One of the most remarkable was the construction of fish weirs and trap structures designed to guide, hold, and harvest fish as they moved with the seasons. Imagine standing at the edge of such a structure centuries ago. The river has begun to recede after months of flooding. Water drains back into channels, and with it, schools of fish migrate, searching for deeper pools. Along the way, they encounter fences of wood and earth arranged in arcs or zigzags. The current carries them forward, but the fences guide them into enclosures from which they cannot easily escape. Families gather at the mouth of the trap, nets and baskets in hand, scooping fish with practiced ease. These traps were not simple. Archaeologists studying them today have identified complex systems: channels dug into floodplains, ponds lined with clay, walls of wooden stakes woven with brush. Some traps were seasonal, designed to capture fish during migrations. Others created permanent ponds where fish could be held until needed. To you, this feels like agriculture in water-ran aquaculture system that ensured food security for communities. Living in one of the most unpredictable environments on Earth, the work required to build them was immense. Wooden stakes had to be cut and driven into the riverbed. Channels had to be dug by hand, sometimes hundreds of meters long. Earth embankments had to be piled up, basket by basket. This was not the effort of a few individuals. It was communal, requiring coordination and planning. The traps themselves became landmarks, visible reminders of shared labor and shared survival. They're silent traps. What other invisible infrastructures of survival lie buried in landscapes we think we understand? You stand again by the silent river. The water flows steadily, unhurried, its surface broken only by drifting leaves. The traps are gone now. The wooden stakes have rotted, the channels filled with silt, and the ponds collapsed into marshland. To most eyes, nothing remains. And yet, if you know where to look, faint lines curve across the land, whispers of a time when this river was not just a river, but a carefully managed lifeline. The decline of the fish traps was not sudden. Like the mounds and roads, they depended on constant maintenance. Every year, stakes had to be replaced, channels cleared, embankments shored up. When communities thrived, this work was routine, as natural as planting crops or building houses. But when populations collapsed, struck by disease, disrupted by migration, fractured by conflict, the systems unraveled. A single season of neglect might not matter, but after several years, with decayed, earth collapsed, and water found new paths. What had once been abundance became silence. By the time Europeans explored the Amazon in the 17th century, many of these systems had already disappeared. What they saw were scattered groups of survivors living by fishing, hunting, and small-scale farming. They assumed that this had always been the case. They did not know that the river they paddled on had once been engineered, that the marshes they dismissed as wilderness had once been structured traps feeding thousands, without stone walls or written records. The memory of these systems vanished almost completely. It took centuries before the truth began to return. Farmers occasionally noticed odd depressions in fields or found lines of stakes buried in mud, but these were seen as natural curiosities. Only in the late 20th century, with the rise of aerial surveys, did the patterns become clear. From above, ponds and channels formed geometric shapes too regular to be natural. Archaeologists began to investigate, and slowly the story emerged. The rediscovery of fish traps has reshaped how we think about the Amazon. They prove that the region once supported large populations, not through fragile hunting and gathering, but through engineered abundance. They show that indigenous peoples did not merely survive in the forest, they transformed it, working with water and soil to create sustainable systems. They remind us that civilization can take many forms, some invisible to outsiders but powerful. Nonetheless, there is a lesson here about resilience. The people of the Amazon faced one of the most unpredictable environments on Earth: floods, droughts, shifting rivers. Yet they devised strategies that turned uncertainty into stability. Their traps captured migrations, their ponds held reserves, their systems fed entire villages. It is a reminder that resilience often emerges not from domination of nature, but from cooperation with it. But there is also a lesson about fragility. A system that required constant human care could not survive catastrophe. When diseases swept through after European contact, killing vast populations, the traps could not endure. Abandoned, they melted back into the forest, leaving only faint traces. In this, the fish traps become metaphors for civilizations themselves. Strong when tended, but vulnerable when abandoned. Today, archaeologists map and study them, but much has already been lost. Modern farming and ranching erase traces as fields are plowed and marshes drained. Without protection, many fish traps may vanish entirely, leaving future generations only with records and photographs. Yet even in their absence, their meaning endures for indigenous communities. The rediscovery of these systems affirms something long known but often dismissed, that their ancestors were builders, engineers, and innovators. Oral traditions recall practices of fishing with fences and channels. The archaeological evidence confirms these memories, giving weight to voices often overlooked in history. And so you reflect, fish traps are not monuments in the usual sense. They do not awe with size or durability. They are quiet, humble structures, designed not to impress, but to sustain. And yet, in their silence, they carry profound meaning. They show that civilizations can thrive without temples of stone, that survival itself can be an art form, and that the most ordinary technologies can carry the weight of worlds. You close your eyes and imagine the harvest once more. Families lining the channels, laughter mixing with the splash of nets, smoke rising from fires where fish are dried and preserved. For them, it was routine, almost dull in other seasons' work in a cycle that had repeated for generations. For you, listening now, it is revelation. What they thought ordinary was, in fact, extraordinary. And so this story ends with a quiet question. If entire civilizations could be sustained by fish traps, now vanished into silence, what equally ordinary details of our own lives might one day be all that remains, whispering to future generations about who we were? Story 6. The gardens hidden beneath the forest floor. You picture the Amazon as endless wilderness. Trees rise like columns, vines hang heavy, and the ground is covered with tangled roots and leaves. It feels ancient, untouched, eternal. And yet, as scientists and archaeologists have discovered, much of what you see is not wild at all. Beneath the canopy, the very composition of the forest reveals human hands. What appears natural is in fact a garden and orchard planted centuries ago, still bearing fruit. For generations, the dominant story about the Amazon was one of untouched nature. Scholars believed the soil was too poor, the floods too unpredictable, the forest too harsh for large populations to shape it. But in recent decades, research has revealed something remarkable. Many areas of the Amazon are not simply forest. They are cultural landscapes, shaped by human activity over centuries. The trees you see, the Brazil nut, the cacao, the acai, pomophone, grow in densities far higher than chance would allow. They were planted, tended, and passed down like orchards. This hidden gardening is most visible in the soil itself. Beneath the forest floor lies terra preta, or black earth. Rich, dark, and fertile, it stands out against the thin, acidic soils of the Amazon. Created by mixing charcoal, bone, shells, and organic waste, terra preta remains productive even today. Farmers who stumble upon patches of it quickly notice that crops flourish there. Unlike natural soils, which lose nutrients quickly, terra preta endures. It is, in essence, the memory of human cultivation written in earth. Imagine walking through the forest centuries ago. The trees around you were not random but chosen. Palms yielding fruit and fiber, nut trees offering protein and oil, medicinal plants hidden among the undergrowth. Families tend these groves, planting seedlings, clearing brush, and managing fire to encourage growth. Over time, the forest itself becomes a garden, disguised as wilderness but carrying the imprint of human care. These gardens supported large populations. Instead of relying solely on fields cleared and abandoned after a few years, people cultivated long-term orchards that provided steady food. Combined with manioc fields and fisheries, these gardens formed part of a resilient system. To outsiders, it may have looked like untouched forest. To those who lived there, it was as cultivated as any farmland. Daily life in these gardens must have been rhythmic, tied to cycles of planting, harvest, and maintenance. Children gathered fruit from low branches, elders collected medicinal leaves, families cracked open Brazil nuts by the fire. Nothing about it seemed extraordinary to them, which was simply life. Yet in this ordinariness lay the ingenuity to sustain millions. The gardens also carried cultural meaning. Certain trees may have been associated with spirits or ancestors. Some groves may have been planted to honor the dead, their fruits offerings. That endured long after rituals ended. In this way, the forest was not only food but memory, linking the living with generations before. For centuries, outsiders missed these gardens entirely. They saw only forest and assumed it was wild. Even today, many visitors walk through and fail to notice the pattern. It is only through scientific surveys, counting tree species, mapping distributions, that the truth emerges. Orchards are hidden. In plain sight, their order disguised as chaos. As you reflect on this, you begin to realize how much of history is invisible. Civilizations leave monuments of stone, but they also leave landscapes reshaped in subtle ways. The Amazon's gardens are proof. They whisper of people who shaped abundance without leaving towering temples. They remind you that cultivation can be disguised as wilderness, that order can be hidden beneath apparent disorder. And so this section closes with a quiet thought. If entire forests can be human-made gardens, how much of the world we call natural is in fact the memory of forgotten hands, tending silently beneath our feet? You return to the forest in your imagination, but now you are looking not at the trees above, but at the soil beneath your feet. Scoop a handful of the earth, and you notice something unusual. In most parts of the Amazon, the soil is pale, sandy, and poor. Nutrients leach away quickly in the heavy rains. Farmers who clear a patch for crops often find it productive for only a few years before it fails. But here, the soil is different. Dark, rich, almost black. Crops planted in it thrive. This is terra preta, the black earth made by human hands. For centuries, Farmers across the Amazon have known of these soils. They call them Terra Preta do Índio, Indian Black Earth. They recognize that these patches are special, producing far more than the surrounding land. For a long time, outsiders dismissed them as accidents, perhaps the result of natural processes, but studies have shown otherwise. Terra Preta contains high levels of charcoal, pottery fragments, bones, and organic waste. It is, in effect, an engineered soil, created deliberately over centuries. The process was simple but profound. Families burned wood in loxygen conditions, producing charcoal rather than ash. They mixed this charcoal with food waste, fish, bones, and broken pottery, layering it into the ground. Over time, microbes and fungi incorporated these materials into a stable, fertile matrix. Unlike ordinary Amazonian soil, which loses nutrients in a few seasons, Terra Preta retains them for centuries. Even today, 500 years after its creation, it remains productive. You can imagine the rhythm of its making. After meals, scraps of food and fish bones were thrown into middens. Broken pots, no longer useful, were discarded. Fires produced charcoal, which was added to waste pits. Slowly, year after year, the soil transformed. What may have seemed like ordinary trash was, in fact, a long-term investment in fertility. Generations passed, but the soil remembered. The scale of Terra Preta is staggering. Patches cover thousands of square kilometers across the Amazon basin. Some are only a few meters wide, others stretch for hectares. Together, they suggest that large populations once cultivated these lands intensively. The forest was not untouched wilderness, but a mosaic of gardens, orchards, and enriched soils. Archaeologists studying these soils began to notice another pattern. The forests growing on Terra Preta were different. They contained higher densities of useful trees: Brazil, newt, acai, cacao, peach palm. These were not random. They were selected, planted, and tended. The forest itself became an orchard, shaped by human choice. Imagine walking through such a forest centuries ago. At first glance, it looks like any other patch of jungle, but as you move through it, you notice the repetition. Palms cluster along paths, heavy with fruit. Brazil nut trees rise tall, their nuts gathered in baskets by families. Cacao pods hang from trunks, their seeds dried for drink or trade. Medicinal plants grow in shaded corners, their uses known by healers. To the people who lived here, this was not wilderness but cultivated abundance. Daily life in these gardens must have been steady, even uneventful. Families tended orchards, harvested fruit, and cleared undergrowth. Children climbed trees for acai berries, women pounded nuts into paste, elders taught the uses of medicinal leaves. These tasks may have felt ordinary, but they sustained entire populations. When combined with manioc fields and fish traps, they created a system resilient, enough to support millions. The rediscovery of these gardens has reshaped how scholars view the Amazon. For centuries, the prevailing belief was that the forest was too harsh for large civilizations. Populations were thought to be small and scattered, unable to thrive in poor soils. The existence of Terra Preta and forest orchards overturns that view. They show that indigenous Amazonians not only survived, but transformed their environment. They created abundance where outsiders saw scarcity, resilience where outsiders imagined fragility. Modern science has even begun to look to Terra Preta for inspiration. Soil scientists study its properties, hoping to replicate its fertility in Other parts of the world, biochar, a modern version of charcoal-enriched soil, is now used in experimental farming, inspired by techniques developed in the Amazon centuries ago. The knowledge of vanished peoples is, in this way, shaping the future of global agriculture. And yet, these gardens remain largely invisible. To an untrained eye, they look like ordinary forest. The soil lies hidden beneath leaves. The orchards disguise themselves as wilderness. Only by studying pattern-tree densities, soil chemistry, archaeological fragments, do the gardens reveal themselves. This invisibility is why they were forgotten. For centuries, scholars looked for stone cities and temples. When they found none, they assumed nothing was here. They did not think to look at the soil, or the trees, or the subtle patterns of cultivation. You might reflect on how fragile memory can be. A temple endures in stone, a wall in brick, but a garden vanishes without caretakers, blending back into forest. And yet, in the Amazon, the gardens never fully disappeared. They persisted as soil and as orchards disguised as natural wilderness. Only now are we learning to see them for what they are, the legacy of civilizations that thrived quietly, without monuments, sustained by patience and soil. As this section closes, you are left with a lingering thought. If forests can be gardens in disguise, how many other landscapes around the world carry the hidden fingerprints of forgotten hands, shaping what we mistake for untouched nature? You walk again through the forest in your imagination, but now every tree seems different. What once looked like chaos reveals patterns. Palms grouped together, nut trees standing in careful clusters, fruit trees more abundant than chance should allow. You realize that this is not simply forest, it is a garden, a living memory of people long gone, and beneath your feet, the soil itself whispers their presence, dark and fertile where it should be thin and poor. The collapse of these gardens was slow, not sudden. Unlike stone monuments toppled in war, orchards fade gradually. When populations decline, whether from epidemic disease, conflict, or migration, the tending stopped. Brush overgrew paths, seedlings sprouted where clearings once stood, and orchards became forests again. To outsiders arriving centuries later, the land appeared wild. The memory of cultivation was buried, not erased, hidden beneath the canopy. This is why European explorers in the Amazon saw only scattered villages and assumed the region had always been sparsely populated. They did not know that, just generations earlier, vast communities had shaped the forest with patience and design. Epidemics carried by first contact decimated populations before explorers penetrated the interior. Without hands to tend the gardens, they returned to wilderness. The silence of the forest misled outsiders into believing it had always been so. Only in recent decades have archaeologists, ecologists, and indigenous voices revealed the truth. By mapping tree distributions, scientists found improbably high densities of useful species. By digging into soil, they uncovered terra preta, still fertile after centuries. By listening to oral traditions, they heard echoes of practices that had never fully disappeared. Together, these lines of evidence confirmed what many indigenous communities had always known. The forest was not untouched, but shaped by ancestors. The rediscovery of these gardens has profound implications. It challenges the old belief that the Amazon was empty of complex societies. It proves that humans can live in harmony with forest ecosystems, creating abundance without destruction. It suggests that civilization need not always mean stone and metal, it can mean orchards, soil, and subtle patterns hidden in plain sight. There is a humility in this realization. The great civilizations of the world are often measured by their monuments, pyramids, temples, palaces. But here in the Amazon, the legacy of civilization is quieter. It is found in fertile soil and in groves of trees that continue to bear fruit. Long after their planters have gone, what endures is not grandeur but sustenance. At the same time, these hidden gardens offer lessons for the future. In a world facing soil depletion and environmental change, Terra Preta shows that it is possible to create fertility that lasts for centuries. The orchards remind us that forests can be managed as living farms without stripping them bare. What vanished societies achieved in the Amazon may hold keys for resilience today. For indigenous descendants, these gardens affirm continuity. They are proof that their ancestors were not passive wanderers, but skilled cultivators and shapers of land. Many practices planting orchards, enriching soil, managing forest, diversity survive in subtle forms today. Archaeology has only confirmed what oral tradition always carried, that the forest is both home and creation. You pause here and imagine a single Brazil nut tree rising tall above the canopy. It was planted centuries ago, perhaps as part of a grove. Generations harvested its nuts, cracked them open by the fire, shared them in feasts. Then tending stopped. The forest reclaimed the grove, but the tree remains, a living monument more enduring than stone. To you, it is just a tree. To those who know, it is history, the gardens hidden beneath. The forest floor reminds us that history is not always written in stone or parchment. Sometimes it is written in soil, in seeds, in the quiet persistence of orchards. They are easy to overlook, but once you learn to see them, they transform the way you understand the Amazon. It is not wilderness. It is memory. And so this story closes with a thought that lingers like the roots beneath your feet. If the very forests we call natural are in fact human-made gardens, how many other landscapes around the world carry hidden legacies we have mistaken for nature, waiting patiently for us to recognize the hands that shaped them? Story 7. The villages that formed circles in the jungle. Close your eyes and imagine flying over the endless green canopy of the Amazon. From above, the forest looks like an unbroken carpet, its trees hiding everything beneath. But with modern technology LiDAR scans that peel away the canopy, something extraordinary appears. Perfect circles, geometric clearings, faint yet undeniable, carved into the soil centuries ago. They are not natural. They are the footprints of villages, built in rings, where houses once stood facing inward toward a central plaza. For a long time, no one believed such places existed. The prevailing image of Amazonian life was one of scattered, isolated bands of families living without large settlements. The soil was too poor, the forest too unforgiving, or so scholars thought. But the discovery of these circles, stretching across regions of Brazil and Bolivia, has changed that story. They reveal a hidden order in the forest, communities planned with care, bound by geometry, and connected by straight roads radiating outward, like spokes of a wheel. The idea of circular villages is not entirely unique to the Amazon. Similar patterns appear in indigenous communities across the Americas, from the Great Plains of North America to the savannas of South America. But in the Amazon, these rings take on a special meaning. They prove that people here were not simply surviving, but organizing, planning, and living within a shared vision of space. Imagine standing in one of these villages centuries ago. The houses form a ring, each built of wood and palm thatch, facing inward toward an open plaza. The plaza is the heart of the community. Here, ceremonies unfold, disputes are resolved, dances are performed, and children play. The arrangement itself carries meaning. Every household has equal access to the center. Every family oriented toward the community rather than away from it. The size of these circles varies. Some are small, holding a few dozen families. Others stretch across hundreds of meters, with space for hundreds of people. In some areas, multiple circles are linked together by straight roads, forming networks of communities. To you, this suggests not isolation but connection, a landscape once filled with villages, bound together in geometric harmony. Daily life in such a village must have been rhythmic. In the morning, smoke rises from hearth fires as families prepare manioc porridge. Children fetch water from nearby streams. Hunters leave through the village's radial roads, heading into the forest. Farmers tend nearby fields, planting manioc, maize, or beans in dark, fertile soils. In the evening, families gather again in the plaza, sharing food, stories, and rituals. The circle is not just a shape, but a way of life, binding individuals into a larger whole. The archaeological traces of these villages are subtle. Wood and thatch decay quickly in the humid forest, leaving little behind. What endures are the ditches and embankments that often marked the edges of settlements. LiDAR reveals these faint lines, showing perfect circles hidden beneath the canopy. Excavations find post holes from houses, fragments of pottery, hearths, and middens filled with food waste. These ordinary remains tell extraordinary stories. The geometry itself is striking. The villages were not haphazardly arranged, but carefully planned. Archaeologists have found that many are aligned to cardinal directions: south, east, west. Roads radiate outward with precision, connecting villages to each other, and perhaps to ceremonial centers. This level of planning suggests shared traditions, perhaps even regional coordination. For you, listening now, the story may feel slow details of post holes, embankments, and soil patterns. But it is in these details that the truth emerges. The Amazon was not empty. It was home to societies that thought in circles, that built with geometry, and that saw community as something to be planned, not improvised. And yet, like so much else in the Amazon, these villages vanished. When Europeans arrived, diseases swept through the region, devastating populations. Villages were abandoned, their wooden houses collapsing into soil, their plazas overgrown by vines. Within a generation or two, the circles disappeared beneath the forest, leaving no trace visible to the human eye. Only now, with satellites and lasers, have they been seen again. As you think about this, a quiet question lingers in your mind. If entire villages once stood in perfect circles beneath the jungle, what does it mean that for centuries we believed the forest was empty, mistaking silence for absence, and forgetting that even geometry can vanish into green? You return in your imagination to the heart of the Amazon, but this time you do not see only forest. You see the faint ring of a ditch curving through the undergrowth, its arc too perfect to be natural. Archaeologists with GPS equipment trace the line, mapping a circle hundreds of meters across. From the air, it becomes clear this was once a village, its houses arranged in a great ring around a plaza. The discovery of these villages came slowly, piece by piece. Farmers clearing land in Acre and Rondania noticed strange circular ditches. Some thought they were defensive works, others natural features. It was only with systematic surveys and later LiDAR imaging that the pattern emerged. Dozens, then hundreds of circular earthworks appeared, many connected by straight roads. Each was the ghost of a community long vanished. The design is deliberate. Post-hole patterns show that houses once stood along the circle's edge, facing inward. Each household looked not outward into the forest, but inward toward the plaza. This central space was not empty. It was the stage of community life. Ceremonies, dances, and councils took place there. Children played in the open ground, while elders gathered to settle disputes or tell stories. The circle embodied a vision of equality and unity. Every family shared access to the plaza, and every household was visible to all others. Archaeologists note that many circles are aligned to the cardinal directions. Roads run straight from the plaza toward north, south, east, and west. These roads often connect to other circles, suggesting regional networks. It is as if the villages were designed not in isolation, but as part of a broader system. Each one a node in a web of geometry stretching across the forest dot. To imagine life here, you need to think in rhythms. At dawn, the village stirs. Smoke rises. From hearth fires, women prepare manioc bread, and hunters set out along the radial roads. Farmers walk to nearby fields, where manioc, beans, and maize grow in soils enriched with terra preta. Children fetch water, play, and learn tasks by watching their elders. At midday, the plaza becomes a gathering place. Goods exchanged, news shared, disputes discussed. At night, the village hums with music, drums echoing in the darkness as dancers honor spirits and ancestors. Pottery shards scattered in the soil revealed the material culture of these villages. Cooking pots blackened by fire tell of meals cooked daily. Painted vessels suggest rituals or feasts. Middens filled with bones show diets rich in fish, manioc, and forest fruits. To archaeologists, these fragments may seem mundane, but together they reveal lives both ordinary and profound. The circle itself carried symbolic weight. Across many indigenous cultures, circles represent cycles of life and death, of seasons, of the cosmos itself. To build a village in a circle was not only practical but meaningful. It placed the community within a sacred geometry, aligning daily life with cosmic order. The roads radiating outward may have represented pathways to other worlds, connections between the village and the universe. What makes these discoveries remarkable is their invisibility until recently. From the ground, centuries of growth concealed them. Trees and vines covered the embankments, and only faint ditches remained. To those who walked there, they appeared natural, but from above, stripped of canopy, the geometry shines. Circles, too perfect to deny, roads too straight to be accidental. The story these villages tell is quiet but powerful. They show that the Amazon was not home only to scattered families. It was a landscape of planned communities, organized and interconnected. It was not chaos but order, not wilderness but civilization. And yet, like so much else, they were abandoned. Epidemics spread invisibly, devastating populations. Within a few generations, villages that had thrived for centuries were empty. Wooden houses collapsed, plazas filled with brush, and the forest reclaimed the land. The geometry of human intention disappeared beneath vines and silence. Still, the traces endure. Archaeologists map them, count them, study them. Indigenous communities recognize them as echoes of ancestral ways. Together, they remind us that civilizations need not leave monuments of stone to prove their presence. Sometimes, a circle in the soil is monument enough. As this section closes, you are left with a lingering reflection. If entire networks of circular villages could vanish into forest, how many other shapes of human order remain hidden in landscapes we assume are untouched? You stand again in the center of the plaza, though now the houses are gone. The air is filled only with the sound of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the calls of distant birds. The circle is faint, its ditches barely visible beneath centuries of soil and roots. Yet when you look closely, or from the ear, the geometry emerges. It is a ghost of community, preserved in the earth. The decline of these villages came gradually, though its cause was no less devastating. Like other Amazonian societies, they suffered from the ripple effects of European contact. Diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles swept through networks of trade and kinship, striking even before direct encounters with Europeans. Populations collapsed, leadership structures faltered, and villages were abandoned. Within a generation, plazas fell silent, roads grew over, and houses melted into soil. What had been vibrant circles of life became indistinguishable from forest. For centuries, these villages remained unknown. European explorers saw only scattered survivors, and assumed that had always been the case. Scholars repeated the narrative. The Amazon was too harsh, too poor, too unstable for large, organized communities. The forest was imagined as wilderness, untouched by human design. The circles hidden beneath the canopy contradicted this, but no one could see them. It took the tools of modern science to bring them back into view. Satellite imagery hinted at patterns, but it was LiDAR that revealed them fully. By sending laser pulses through the canopy, archaeologists could strip away the trees and see the ground beneath. Circles, squares, and roads appeared, hundreds of them, spread across vast regions. What had been invisible for centuries became undeniable. The Amazon had been a landscape of geometry, of planned villages and networks. These rediscoveries have forced a rethinking of what civilization means. For centuries, it was defined by stone monuments, writing, or metal. The Amazon had none of these, and so it was dismissed as empty. But the circles prove otherwise. Civilization can be written in earthworks and plazas, in the arrangement of houses around a shared space, in the geometry of community life. The absence of stone does not mean the absence of order. Daily life in these villages may have seemed ordinary to their inhabitants, but in that ordinariness lay resilience. Families cooking manioc, children playing in plazas, traders carrying goods along radial roads all contributed to societies that endured for centuries. Their circular design expressed values of equality, connection, and shared space. They remind us that architecture is not only about buildings, but about the way communities choose to live together. The symbolism of the circle lingers. It represents unity, cycles, and balance. To build in a circle was to embody those values in daily life. It placed every household in relation to every other, facing inward toward the community. It erased hierarchy of placement, replacing it with shared orientation. The circle was both practical and philosophical, shaping how people understood themselves. What remains today are faint lines, visible only with technology, but those lines are enough to transform how we think of the Amazon. They revealed that this was not wilderness but a peopled landscape filled with networks of villages planned with care. They remind us that absence in the historical record does not mean absence in reality. It may simply mean we have not yet learned how to see. The rediscovery of these villages also raises a humbling thought. How much of human history is hidden not by distance, but by blindness? For centuries, we assumed the Amazon was empty. Only when we learned to look differently did the circles emerge. Perhaps the same is true elsewhere. Histories buried not beneath forest, but beneath assumptions. And so you leave this story with a quiet reflection. If entire societies could vanish into green silence, their circles hidden for centuries, what other patterns of human life remain invisible in the landscapes we take for granted, waiting for us to learn how to see them? Daily life revolved around them. In the wet season, when rivers swelled, communities waited patiently. The forest flooded, fish spread across vast areas, and hunting them was difficult. But as the waters receded, the traps filled. Families gathered. Along the enclosures, children splashing in the shallows, elders giving instructions, and everyone working together to harvest. Fish were eaten fresh, smoked, or dried for storage. The harvest sustained not only the immediate household, but also supported gatherings, feasts, and trade with neighboring communities. The variety of fish caught was staggering. The Amazon is home to thousands of species: catfish, piranha, tombac, pacu, and even giant arapima. Each had its season and habits, and the builders of traps understood them intimately. They knew when migrations would begin, where currents would carry schools, and how to design structures to maximize the catch. Such knowledge was not accidental. It was built over generations, passed down in stories and practices. What makes these traps remarkable is not just their effectiveness, but their subtlety. Unlike massive dams or canals elsewhere in the world, Amazonian fish traps blended with the environment. They did not dominate rivers, but guided them. They worked with seasonal rhythms instead of against them. And because they were made of wood and earth, they decayed quickly when abandoned, leaving behind only faint traces. This is why their discovery took so long. For centuries, they were invisible, mistaken for natural features. Archaeologists now see them as evidence of large, organized populations. To sustain tens of thousands of people on river islands or floodplains required reliable food systems. Fish traps, combined with manioc cultivation and orchards, provided that stability. They were, in a sense, the silent infrastructure of Amazonian civilizations, never monumental, always practical, but essential. You can imagine how the construction of traps shaped social life. Groups had to decide where to place them, how to share the labor, and how to distribute the catch. Rules must have governed who could fish where, when the harvest took place, and how much was stored. Conflict may have arisen over ownership, but cooperation was necessary for survival. The traps were not just technology, they were social contracts, binding communities together through shared reliance on water to you. This may sound almost boring compared to tales of great battles or monumental temples, yet this is where history truly lives in the details of survival, in the quiet ingenuity of people who made abundance from uncertainty. These fish traps, humble as they seem, sustained entire societies. Without them, the great mounds, plazas, and roads of the Amazon would not have been possible. As you reflect on this, the image of the river returns. Its waters recede, revealing stakes, ditches, and ponds carefully shaped by human hands. Families gather, laughter mixing with the splashing of nets. The harvest is plentiful, and the community endures. Centuries later, the structures have vanished, the people forgotten, but the memory lingers in soil and in the faint lines seen from the air. And so you are left with a quiet question. If fish traps, made of nothing more than wood and earth, sustain whole civilizations, what other invisible technologies of survival lie forgotten? Hidden beneath the rivers and forests we think we know, you return to the banks of the silent river. The morning mist has lifted, and the sun glints off the water. What you see is deceptively simple: shallow ditches, a line of stakes, a depression in the mud. But when archaeologists map these faint traces, they reveal entire systems networks of channels, ponds, and enclosures stretching for kilometers. Each one was once a carefully engineered machine for survival. The basic principle of a fish trap was straightforward: use the river's own rhythms to catch its abundance. But the execution required patience, knowledge, and communal labor. Wooden stakes were cut from forest, trees straight, strong, and resilient. These were driven into the riverbed in long rows, sometimes curved into arcs, sometimes arranged in zigzags. Brush or woven mats filled the gaps, guiding fish toward narrowing funnels. At the end of the funnel lay an enclosure where fish gathered in great numbers, unable to escape. Some traps were permanent, maintained year after year. Others were seasonal, rebuilt with each flood cycle. Archaeologists studying the patterns note that many were positioned precisely in floodplains where receding waters concentrated fish. These were not guesses, but the result of generations of observation. The builders knew how the river rose and fell, how fish migrated, how currents shifted. They transformed unpredictable waters into reliable harvests. Imagine a harvest day centuries ago. The floodwaters are retreating, and schools of tambaqui and pacu swim downstream. They follow the current into a narrowing channel, unaware of the trap ahead. Villagers wait with baskets, nets, and spears. The fish surge into the enclosure, thrashing and flashing in the shallow water. With practiced coordination, families scoop them up, laughing, shouting instructions, and working together until the trap is full. Some fish are eaten fresh that evening, others smoked over slow fires, still others dried and stored for lean months. Such harvests were not just about food. They were social events, binding communities together. Everyone took part: children carrying baskets, elders overseeing, families sharing the catch. Rituals may have accompanied the harvests: offerings made to river spirits in gratitude for abundance. In this way, fish traps were both technology and tradition, woven into the spiritual as well as practical fabric of life. The scale of some systems is astonishing. In parts of Brazil and Bolivia, aerial surveys have revealed networks of ditches and ponds covering vast areas. Some traps appear linked, forming chains across landscapes. In places, they connect to raised fields where crops were grown, creating integrated systems of food production. Fish from water, manioc from earth, fruit from orchards. Together, they supported populations numbering in the tens of thousands. Yet, when Europeans arrived, these systems were already in decline. Epidemics swept through the region, killing most of the people who maintained the traps. Without regular repair, wooden stakes rotted, channels filled with silt, and ponds collapsed. Within a generation or two, structures that had sustained entire civilizations disappeared into the landscape. To later settlers, they seemed like natural features: marshes, ridges, and ponds without obvious meaning. The memory of their builders faded. Only in recent decades have archaeologists begun to recognize their true significance. Satellite imagery, drone photography, and ground surveys reveal patterns invisible from the ground. In some regions, geometric arrangements of ponds and ditches stretch for kilometers. Their regularity proves they were not accidents of nature, but the products of design. Excavations confirm the presence of wooden stakes, charcoal from fires used in maintenance, and pottery, shards left by families who once worked nearby. For archaeologists, studying these traps is slow, unglamorous work. Mapping requires days under the hot sun, walking across fields, measuring faint depressions. Excavating a single pond may reveal nothing more dramatic than layers of mud, interspersed with traces of wood, yet each small detail matters. Together, they confirm that the Amazon was not empty wilderness, but a cultural landscape engineered for survival. To you, this may seem almost dull shards of pottery, soil layers, faint lines in the mud. But in these boring details lies a revelation. The traps prove that people here had mastered aquaculture long before Europeans imagined such things possible. They show that indigenous Amazonians were not passive inhabitants of the forest, but active shapers of its ecology. Their fish traps were as important to their survival as the aqueducts were to Rome or the canals to Mesopotamia. The cultural meaning of these structures lingers even today. Some indigenous communities still build small-scale fish traps using traditional methods. Wooden fences guide fish into enclosures, and families harvest them together, much as their ancestors did. In these practices, the past is not entirely gone. It survives in gestures, techniques, and knowledge passed quietly across generations. And so you are left with a paradox. The traps were designed for abundance, yet their materials, wood, earth, brush, were fragile. They lasted only as long as people maintained them. Once abandoned, they melted back into the landscape, leaving only faint traces. The silence of the rivers today hides centuries of ingenuity. As this section closes, you reflect on the roads, the mounds, the pottery, and now the fish traps. Each whispers of societies that thrived where outsiders once assumed only wilderness. And you are left with the lingering question: if rivers once carried the abundance of civilizations in Story 1, the lost civilization buried beneath the Amazon. You close your eyes and imagine the endless canopy of the Amazon rainforest. To you, it seems eternal, untouched, and ancient. Yet beneath the roots of towering trees and the weaving vines, there are traces of another world, a civilization that flourished long before European explorers arrived, and then, almost without a sound, disappeared. The Amazon has long been described as a green ocean, a place of natural power that seemed hostile to human settlement. For centuries, historians and archaeologists believed that the soil, poor in nutrients and prone to flooding, could never sustain large populations. You may have read that the jungle was a wilderness, home only to scattered tribes, hunters, and fishers. That view shaped how the outside world thought of this region. A natural cathedral, yes, but never the stage for great cities. And yet, the first whispers of something more significant came from explorers' journals. In the early 16th century, Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana journeyed along the Amazon River. His writings described immense settlements, villages stretching for miles, and fields cultivated with a strange dark earth. He spoke of warriors, organized armies, and rulers with authority. But his reports were dismissed as exaggerations, the tales of a man who had become lost in the jungle and imagined grandeur where none existed. For centuries, scholars preferred to see the Amazon as timeless wilderness, rather than as a landscape that had once been remade by human hands. It was not until modern times, with satellites peering through the canopy and archaeologists patiently digging, that the forest began to give up its secrets. Slowly, you realize that the jungle was not always so impenetrable. Beneath its green veil are earthworks, roads, and ditches arranged in geometric patterns. There are mounds that rise like forgotten pyramids, their shapes softened by centuries of rain and roots. These are not the works of scattered people. They are the remains of a civilization vast, organized, and long ignored. You can picture the builders shaping the land. They dug ditches not only for defense, but also for managing water in a landscape where rivers flood and retreat. They raised mounds to protect their homes and ceremonial spaces from rising waters. They built causeways that stretched across wetlands, linking villages together. To stand in one of these sites today is to feel the strangeness of order hidden in apparent chaos. A circle of earth the size of a football field may be nothing more than a faint ridge beneath the trees, but to the people who built it, it was the center of community life. Their secret weapon was not stone or iron, but soil. The Amazon's earth is notoriously poor, yet these people created a soil known as Terra Preta Black Earth. It is rich, fertile, and still productive centuries later. You might imagine them mixing charcoal, pottery shards, fish bones, and organic waste, layering the soil until it could nourish crops. It was not an accident. It was engineering, a deliberate reshaping of nature. Even today, farmers who stumble upon pockets of this black earth find themselves able to grow more than the surrounding lands would allow. The very soil remembers their skill, even if the names of its makers are lost. Daily life must have revolved around cycles of water, crops, and ritual. Imagine waking in a wooden house raised on stilts above the damp ground, the morning mist clinging to the air. You would walk out to the gardens, planting manioc maize and fruits in carefully tended fields. The air would carry the hum of insects, the cries of birds, and the rhythm of daily labor. Across the river, neighbors in another settlement would be doing the same, their lives intertwined with yours through trade, marriage, and shared rituals. We often think of civilization in terms of stone cities, temples, and monuments. But here, in the Amazon, civilization expressed itself differently in wood, soil, and water. Nothing lasted forever in this humid climate, except the patterns they carved into the land. The walls, the mounds, and the dark earth remain long, after the timber rotted and the voices faded. What is striking is not what they built, but how much they adapted the forest itself. They did not conquer it with stone, but bent it with patience, reshaping it with fire, with water channels, and with gardens that imitated the forest. For you, listening now, the story may seem slow, almost uneventful, but that is the point. This civilization lived not in sudden wars or dazzling monuments, but in the daily rhythm of survival. They built with wood that melted back into the soil, and their greatest invention was earth itself. And perhaps that is why they were forgotten, because they left behind little that seemed impressive to those who came later, who measured greatness in marble and gold. As you drift into this story, you begin to wonder how many civilizations have vanished simply because their achievements were made of fragile things. How many human lives disappeared because history prefers stone and ignores soil. And so you close this first chapter of thought, left with the quiet question: if a civilization could rise, thrive, and vanish beneath the Amazon? What other worlds lie hidden under our feet, waiting to be rediscovered? You return again to the dense canopy of the Amazon, but now you see it differently. Instead of an eternal wilderness, you begin to picture it as a palimpsest, a layered page of history, written and rewritten by generations of human hands. Beneath the green silence, archaeologists today find networks of ditches, raised fields, and remnants of settlements, each telling a quiet story of adaptation. When the first archaeologists began mapping these earthworks from the ground, the scale was not immediately clear. You might imagine a researcher in the mid-20th century, machete in hand, cutting through vines only to stumble upon a ridge that curved in too perfect a circle to be natural. At first, such discoveries seemed isolated curiosities, but with the arrival of new technologies, satellite imaging, and, more recently, LiDAR light detection and ranging, the scope widened. From above, patterns emerged, geometric enclosures, straight roads cutting through otherwise chaotic forest, clusters of circular and rectangular structures etched into the soil. What once looked like random clearings became evidence of planning. You realize that hundreds of interconnected communities once stretched across vast territories. In some regions of the Brazilian Amazon, archaeologists have identified geometric earthworks spanning more than 250 kilometers. These were not villages hidden deep in isolation, but parts of a regional system, almost like a chain of pearls connected by invisible threads. Life here required ingenuity. Unlike the Nile, the Tigris, or the Yellow River, the Amazon's floods were unpredictable and destructive. To live here meant to work with water's shifting moods. The people raised mounds, on which they built homes, ensuring protection from sudden floods. They constructed fish weirs and trapped intricate wooden structures that guided fish into enclosures during seasonal migrations. Imagine standing by the river as a community drew in nets, pulling food from water, not by chance, but by engineering, passed down through generations. In the fields, the secret lay in terra preta. Farmers carefully enriched the earth. Charcoal made from slow-burning fires stabilized nutrients, while layers of organic matter turned poor soil into fertile ground. You picture families tending to hearth fires, deliberately feeding the soil, with fragments of bone, plant matter, and broken pottery. This was not waste, but design. And so, in a land where outsiders saw only hunger and difficulty, they created abundance. The crops they cultivated reveal a world familiar yet different. Manioc, both bitter and sweet varieties, formed the foundation of their diet. Processing. Manioc was laborious, peeling, grating, soaking, and cooking to remove toxins before it could be eaten safely. But the effort provided a steady, storable food base. Alongside manioc came maize, beans, squash, and countless fruskoporsu, acai, guava. The forest itself was shaped to yield food. Studies of forest composition suggest that many areas of wild Amazonian forest are, in fact, anthropogenic orchards disguised as wilderness. Generations of people planted and tended groves of Brazil nuts, cacao, and palm trees, leaving behind a hidden legacy of agriculture disguised as nature. Social life unfolded in patterns now faintly visible in the ground. Villages often formed, circles with houses arranged around central plazas. You can imagine daily gatherings there, rituals, dances, disputes resolved, stories told. The symmetry hints at an intentional order, a shared understanding of how life should be structured. A village was not simply scattered huts, it was a community woven into geometry. Spiritual life, to left traces. Wooden posts that once stood tall in ceremonial enclosures have long rotted, but their patterns remain in the soil. Figurines found in middens suggest belief systems tied to fertility, animals, and ancestors. Yet the details remain elusive. Unlike stone temples, these spiritual spaces were fleeting, absorbed back into the earth. To you, this ephemerality feels almost deliberate, spirituality rooted in cycles of decay and renewal, rather than permanence.